Dear ladies and gentlemen, today I have the great honor to introduce you to Dr. Hyun Jin Kim from the University of Melbourne. Dr. Kim is a somewhat unique expert in the field of Asian and classics history combined, in that he studies the steppe empires from basically the eastern regions of China up to the Huns in Hungary, and has done his studies in New Zealand, then his doctoral studies in England at the University of Oxford, and is now based in the wonderful, and as I just heard from him, not so hot city of Melbourne. Hyun Jin Kim, thank you very much for joining us.
It's a pleasure, and thank you for your very kind invitation and that very kind introduction.
So just let us start with what is, as I think, one of your key fields of study. Who were the Huns and why is it important to clarify their origins?
Yes, I would start with a counter-argument of sorts. I think it's not very important to know their origins, in the sense that it is important to decipher their origins if we were looking at their cultural origins and political origins. But I think scholarship, especially scholarship that concerns the Xiongnu and the Han connection, have focused too much on the ethnic or racial provenance of the Huns. And this says more about us and our preoccupations, I think, than the historical reality of the connections between the Huns and the Xiongnu. So there was, of course, a very powerful steppe Eurasian empire called, in modern scholarship, the Xiongnu, in what is now modern Mongolia, northern China, and parts of modern-day Kazakhstan. And this empire lasted for over 400 years. And there is mounting evidence which suggests that the Huns who appear in Europe and also later in Central Asia as the White Huns, that both of them originated from this political entity. That is not to say that this means they are racially identical or ethnically identical. This means that whoever the European Huns were, or the Central Asian Huns were, they claimed to originate from this political entity by using the political name Han. So Xiongnu, of course, is the modern Mandarin transliteration. In Old Chinese and also in early Middle Chinese, that name sounded more like Hunnu. And we have multiple documentary evidence from the 3rd century, which indicates very precisely that the name Xiongnu was rendered Han by people in Central Asia and also probably in China as well at the time. So I think the debate is almost closed in that the name Han is Xiongnu. But of course, if, for example, there was a core group of ethnic, now the Xiongnu Empire was not an ethnic group, right? This was an imperial state, a multi-ethnic polyglot state. Even the elite of the Xiongnu Empire were very diverse. And let us presume that a portion of this group migrated over 200 years from what is now modern Mongolia to the Pontic steppe and further on to Hungary. During this long period of time, during their expansion westward, of course, the obvious thing happened. They mixed extensively with the people that they encountered. So much so that Hunnic graves, or what we think to be Hunnic graves in Hungary, have yielded, well, if you look at the skeletal remains, and also this is backed up by DNA evidence, almost 75% of the people who were buried there had no traceable East Asian heritage. Right? So only about a quarter of people who we think were Huns and were buried in Hungary have East Asian Mongoloid features. Right? So it is, of course, entirely likely that at least some of the Huns originated, from East Asia at some point. But by the time that they arrived in Western Europe, most of them looked very Caucasian. And as to why that would even matter, Whether they looked East Asian or Caucasian, that's beyond me. But that was the preoccupation of past scholarship. And therein lies the problem. So what I think we should be focusing on is the cultural baggage and the political baggage that the Huns brought with them. So basically, as I explained earlier, the Xiongnu Empire was situated in Eastern Eurasia. It covered basically the whole of what is now southern Siberia and northern China, and also parts of Central Asia. And Chinese sources indicate that the Huns, after their empire splintered into northern and southern halves, that the northern group was settled in the Altai region. So the Altai region is that area where Kazakhstan, Russia, and China all meet. So it's an interesting place. And I think the next question that you sent to me earlier, I think, is where we should sort of head to now.
Yes, I think that's quite right. It's what the Huns, or how the Huns were influenced by other previous steppe empires. So I think that is exactly what you mean regarding the Xiongnu.
Yes. So the Xiongnu, of course, it's a bit debatable as to whether we should classify the Xiongnu as a previous empire. I suppose it is, given the fact that the Hunnic Empire in Europe was not in the same geographical location as the old Hunnic Empire in East Asia. So the question is, scholarship has often argued that the Huns who arrived in Europe were a bunch of disorganized barbarians, right? So they had no political organization whatsoever. And that's, of course, due to the misinformation that was spread by Ammianus Marcellinus, who basically based his ethnography on the Huns on earlier ethnography. He had obviously not met a single Hun in his life. He didn't know much about them. But unfortunately, that ethnographic treatise was taken very seriously by whole generations of historians. And as a consequence, it's very difficult to understand the Huns if you just go by Ammianus. So what we need to do, of course, is turn to Eastern sources and the archaeology. And if we look at Chinese sources in particular, we do encounter information about the political organization of Central Asian and Inner Asian states, right, who were contemporaneous with the Huns. So the Huns, in case people didn't know, they originated from Central Asia, right? Originally, some of them might have come from Mongolia, but before they entered Europe, they were situated in what is now Kazakhstan and Western Mongolia. And from there, a group of them expanded south into what is now Uzbekistan and created the White Hunnic Empire, which later conquered Persia and parts of northwestern India and so on and so forth. But that doesn't really concern us. What we are concerned about, of course, is the northern group, which then proceeded into what is now southern Russia. Now, before the Huns departed and became infamous or famous, depending on how you'd like to view things.
Both, yeah.
Both, yes. They were surrounded by different Inner Asian states that all shared very similar political practices. So if you look at the old Xiongnu or the Han Empire, it practiced, I suppose, a form of quasi-feudalism. Now, I hate to use the word feudalism because it gives the wrong impression. And when people hear feudalism, they think of late medieval Europe, right?
Yes, the knife and shining armor.
Yes, that's not what I'm talking about. It's more, I suppose, I've used various terms to try to explain it, but it's the Inner Asian style of governance, which looks like and very closely resembles the early medieval Frankish incipient proto-feudalism or centralized feudalism, where the king, the high king, distributes fiefs to his brothers and relatives. So the Xiongnu system is a hierarchical system in which there is the emperor called Chanyu. That's the modern Chinese pronunciation, but probably in Old Chinese, the transliteration sounds more something like Dargua, which later on, interestingly, during the Mongol period, becomes Daruga, which merely means tax collector. So the title was downgraded.
Quite a lot, yes.
So during the Turkic period, Tarkan was a more sort of elevated title, but then it sunk even further during the Mongol period.
would be a little bit like if in a few hundred years the post collector would be called prime minister.
Yeah, so something like that. Yes. So there is the emperor at the top, and then he assigns major provinces in his empire to his next of kin, right? His brothers, his cousins, and so the most important core regions are distributed to these sub-kings, and then lesser provinces and lesser districts to noble families who are allied to the ruling house or related to them by marriage. Right? So this is the system that was in practice in the Hunnic Empire in Asia. And this is also very similar to the system that existed in the Han Chinese Empire. Right? So they have very similar modes of governance, although with very important differences, obviously. But if you go further west to where the Huns originally were before they bolted west into Russia, you have a group called the Yuezhi, who created the Kushan Empire in what is now Central Asia and India. They also had a very, very similar political system as the Huns. To the west of the Huns, there was a group called the Kangju, again, very similarly organized. The Wusun to the south, again, with very similar organization. So everywhere around them, the Huns had politically advanced states. And so to say that the Huns who conquered all of these people before they entered Europe did not have political organization would be lunacy, in my view. So I think the account of Ammianus has to be dismissed. And all the, I suppose, scholarly views that originate from Ammianus. Right? So if we throw that out, then I think we are in a better place and we're able to assess what we have in the Greco-Roman sources a lot better. So yes, that would be my answer to the question. How were they influenced?
So they were influenced in a political sense, that they very likely must have adopted a sophisticated political system.
Yes.
Which I think, as you described it, not only resembles feudalism, but also the way how many early Middle Eastern empires were ruled. Like, for example, delegating fiefs to leading families, and your next of kin sounds awfully like how the Achaemenids and later Persian empires organized their empires, basically.
Yes, the King of Kings, right? That's exactly the right title, of course, to describe the Achaemenids. And interestingly enough, there is an argument, this is, of course, something that is still debated, that at least the eastern half of the Persian Empire was basically ruled by Scythian sub-kings of the Achaemenid High King, right? So this is an argument that was proposed by a scholar called Vogelsang. I think he's German, actually.
I think so.
Well, his name certainly sounds German.
Yes.
And it's, I think it's probably closer to the truth of the matter. And there is also an argument that the Achaemenid dynasty itself, well, not the Achaemenid dynasty, but the Theespid dynasty of Cyrus, that which later, of course, the Achaemenids overthrew, was of Cimmerian origin, that they likewise had this iteration steppe origin, and that therein lies the reason behind this similarity, I suppose. But that's something which is, of course, way beyond the topic of the Huns.
Okay, thank you very much. And you already mentioned Marcellus Ammianus, and my next question is somewhat related to his view of a very barbarian kind of Hun. We know from him that supposedly the Huns were so barbaric that they didn't even bother to put iron or bronze or any metal on their arrow tips, but used stone instead. And well, this brings me to the topic that although they were a steppe empire and the Romans sort of knew how to deal with steppe empires, since they had dealt with Scythians in Dacia for centuries and had warred with Parthians and Sassanids for a few hundred years before the Huns arrived. So why were the Huns so successful in military terms, where supposedly any of their predecessors failed?
Well, I think you have to look at the political organization of the Huns yet again, right? So if the Huns were an organized imperial state, what we have is a new geopolitical situation. So before the Huns arrived, the geopolitical situation faced by the Romans was as follows. They had a sedentary, well, largely sedentary, and also imperial level entity in the Parthian Empire, and then of course the Sasanian Empire next door, which they had to face in their eastern backyard. Now to the north, of course, there were formidable Germanic tribal confederacies. These confederacies were very menacing and very dangerous, but of course one thing that they lacked was centralized organization and the political capacity. Later on they achieve it, of course, after the Huns enter the scene. They do achieve this in the 5th century and the 6th century and so on and so forth, but not in the 3rd century and the 4th century, right? So although the Germanic tribes were a constant menace, they did not pose an existential threat to the Roman imperial system. But when the Huns arrived, what they did, of course, was they united all of traditional barbaricum, right, all of the non-Roman territory in Europe into a single imperial state. And that posed an immense problem because A, it cut off the Roman source of mercenary recruitment. Of course, if you enter into the later Roman period, increasingly the Roman army is dependent on recruits that they accessed in so-called barbarian, territory, right? So this source of mercenary recruitment was cut off. And the Huns were formidable in the sense that they were organized enough to persistently carry on sustained warfare. So instead of sporadic invasions, you get, or raids, what you have is wars of conquest. And the Huns, of course, and this probably ties into a question that we'll discuss later, but what they were attempting to do was to subject the Roman Empire to tribute. They regarded the Romans as their vassals, which was something that the Romans could not fathom, right? How on earth could anyone regard us as tributaries? And because the Huns had already had experience of subjecting large territorial entities in Central Asia and in East Asia to tribute, this was something that came naturally to these Hunnic rulers. For example, Uldin declared all land under the sun was his, right? And he wasn't even the high king of the Huns, right? He was. Yes. If you look at the description that is given of him, he's a regulus, he's a sub-king, but still he was probably the Hunnic royal who was in possession of the western half of the Hunnic state at the time, right? So his name says it all because it's likely that his name means the sixth lord, right? So what that means is that the Huns had a system whereby there was a supreme aristocratic council consisting of 6 high-ranking sub-kings, right? So the fact that he's called a sixer means probably that he was one of these 6 kings who was put in charge of
but not the high king,
but certainly not the high king, but that comes later as the center of the Hunnic state moves further west. So, for example, Attila basically tells, Priscus reports that Attila regarded the Roman emperors to be the equal of his generals, right? So his subordinates. And he, in one of the letters that he incidentally sends to the Western Roman Emperor Valentinian, he commands the Hunnic ambassador tells the Roman emperor that my lord Attila, your master and mine, commands you to prepare a dwelling for him, here. So, I mean, that kind of rhetoric, of course, is what really frightened the Romans. And they thought, of course, that the Huns were out to conquer the Roman Empire outright. But as I've mentioned, and this kind of answers, I think, one of the questions that we were planning to address later, they could have conquered. There is no reason why they could not have, at least the western half anyway. Constantinople was a very difficult nut to crack, and probably without the help of a navy, the Huns would not have achieved the capture of Constantinople. But interestingly, the Huns were the only sort of barbarian group up till that time who had the capacity to storm Roman fortifications, right? So
yes, that's very curious, isn't it?
Yes, they had siege weaponry. So in other words, in order to have that kind of military equipment and bring them along and had to have the manpower and the logistics to pull that off, of course, that requires a state apparatus. So that, again, is proof that the Huns were a different entity from, the usual, largely sort of, primitively organized tribal confederacy. they, of course, in one war, the War of 447, Attila sacks 70 cities in the Balkans at one go. So this was an
Yes.
enormous shock that the Huns could actually besiege and take cities. And so they could conquer. But then, of course, something curious happens thereafter. Attila has conquered all of the European provinces of the Eastern Roman Empire, and then he just gives them back. He says that he's very much, he annexes the area directly south of the Danube. But even that, he says, I'm willing to give back. Right? What he wants is tribute. And he regards the Roman emperors to be his vassals who owe him obedience.
So your argument, to sum it up, would be that it's not so much steppe tactics which is new what we Huns bring to Europe, but rather a very strategic and organized way of bundling up the military power of Barbaricum, so to speak, through that all in one go against any frontier of the European half of the Roman empires, and thereby overwhelm the defenders, and then also have the ability to lay siege and actually do something more than just burn the fields and scorch the earth of the dry land.
Yes, and also they had the capacity to offer an alternative to the various barbarian people, or so-called barbarian peoples of Europe, as the Romans saw it. So before the Huns arrived, of course, there was no alternative to Roman hegemony. When the Huns arrived, they provided an alternative, which was damaging to imperial prestige. And but I suppose the answer to the last question would be that the Huns did not aim at complete conquest. In fact, the White Huns do the same. They conquer Persia, but they refuse to annex it. They annex only the eastern provinces of the Sasanian Empire and allow the Sasanian king to rule as a vassal. And of course, the Sasanians have to pay tribute to the White Huns for almost a century before the Turks emerge, and the Hephthalites are defeated by the Turks at Bukhara, and that leads to the liberation of the Sasanian Persians. So the mindset of the Huns is very different from what we think it is, and so yes, I mean, Attila was aiming at what he was aiming at was subjugation, but not outright conquest of the Roman state.
Okay, I think that leads neatly over to my then last question, which would regard your assessment of the battle on the Catalonian Fields, or Battle of Chalon-sur-Marne, in which, for those viewers of us who do not know the story, which is normally told, that Attila basically lay siege to, I think it was Orléans in France, and then withdrew, and on his way back to Hungary, he was met by quite overwhelming force under Aetius, or at least great force, and then more or less squarely beaten. At least that's what the normal interpretation of the sources says. And I think you basically turn it around in your argument and say, no, Catalonian Fields was quite the decisive victory for the Huns.
Well, not decisive, but I suppose my argument would be, the reason that I came to that conclusion was the following. Now, Jordanes is the main text. He provides the narrative history for the battle, and historians have assumed that this goes back to Priscus, right? So we've already mentioned Priscus. He's the most important 5th century source for the interaction between the Romans and the Huns. And Priscus is very, very good, actually. If you look at his work, he's a diplomat. He has actually been to the Hunnic capital. He knows the Huns, and his history is very, very informative, and I think is full of details that are worth taking very seriously. But the problem with Jordanes' version of Priscus's story, if it is Priscus's story, which I think it is not, is that, and all critics, there is no scholar who disagrees with this, the account has been heavily reconfigured in order to glorify Jordanes' darlings, his own Goths, right, the Visigoths. So the Visigoths, according to Jordanes' version of events, the Romans were very, very cowardly and useless. And so they played no particular role whatsoever in the Allied victory. And it was the Visigoths who, after their king had been killed in the initial stages of the battle, who would just charge and demolish the Huns, right? So it's all due to the Visigoths. Now, I think there is not a single scholar who is living, either in the past or today, who thinks that that is actually what happened, right? So everybody agrees that there is a massive sort of pro-Gothic sort of rewriting that is going on here by Jordanes. And
Jordanes was writing basically on behalf of the Gothic king.
Well, actually, no, he was actually writing in the Eastern Roman Empire. So,
okay.
But he was a Goth. He himself, well, he identified himself as a Goth. And so he was out to glorify his Goths whenever possible. It is very evident in everything that he writes. Oh. And of course, I mean, a bit of ethnic pride, why not? But the problem is that, no Roman writer would have written it that way, right? So in other words, Priscus could not possibly have written it that way. And to make it even worse, the battle narrative is completely modeled after the marathon battle narrative that you find in Herodotus. The sequence of events, the deployment of troops is exactly the same. Even what happens after the battle follows the same narrative sequence. So that rings alarm bells immediately. And this was already noticed long and long ago. Yes. So I'm not the first person to say this. I think I'm the person to lay it out most in a lengthy fashion, but this has already been pointed out earlier. And so that means that the Jordanes' account, and he's also not a contemporary source, right? He's writing almost 100 years after the event. He's not contemporary. So I think Jordanes has to be discounted, and we have to rely upon contemporary sources. And here it gets very interesting. So there are 4 contemporary sources that tell you about the battle. Now, Hydatius, who is one of those sources, writing from Spain, is very, very unreliable when it comes to information outside of Iberia. So he makes all kinds of mistakes all over the place. I think he's
out.
He's not as valuable as the others in terms of being an accurate source. So that leaves us with 3 sources, all 3 of which are Gallic, right? So in other words, they derive from France, what is now France, the area that is concerned. So these 3 are the most important. One, of course, is Prosper of Aquitaine. As his name implies, he is from France, from southern France, and he is the best source by far of events in Gaul at the time. The other very, very good source is the Gallic Chronicle, anonymous, right? We don't know who was the author, of 452, and the Gallic Chronicle of 511. Now, 511, of course, implies that this is not contemporaneous, but the Gallic Chronicle of 511 is based on earlier sources, which are very, very good. So all 3 sources count as quasi or fully contemporary sources. Now, Prosper says the following about the battle. He says, there was a huge battle, there was immense slaughter, and then after the battle, he says, it appears, he does not say this is what happened, he says, it appears that the Huns were not victorious because the Huns who survived lost their taste for battle and did not continue in their invasion, right? So now that's a very, very ambiguous statement. What if the Romans actually won the battle decisively? They would let us know.
Yes, I think so.
I've been studying classical history all my life, and the Romans are not reticent about declaring victory.
They would have set up 1 or 2 monuments, I guess. Yes.
Yeah. So it's very odd that Prosper, who was who's who was a witness to the events of the time, would say this, and then we get the Gallic Chronicle of 511, which says exactly the same. He says that there was immense slaughter, and the author of the chronicle does not even say who won. He just says that King Theodoric of the Visigoths, he died, and also King Laudaricus, which means Lauda, the king, who was a blood relative of Attila, was also killed. And he says he doesn't tell you who won the battle. Again, very, very bizarre. So of the 3 sources that actually matter, 2 says they don't really know who won the battle. And then, of course, the remaining 452 chronicle says that Attila was defeated, but that the slaughter was immense and blah, 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 the same stuff. But only one of the 3 sources tells us and in a very sort of abrupt fashion, that the Huns were defeated. Now, so we've got conflicting information being given by our sources. Two says they don't really know who won, and one says that the Romans won. Now, so in order to get to the heart of the matter as to who won the battle, it's, I think, very important to determine who had possession of the battlefield after the battle. Mm-hmm. Because, of course, in antiquity, the army that was in possession of the battlefield was the army that won the battle. Right?
That's a regular case, at least, yes.
Yes, well, yes, that's right. And all of the traditions imply, including the Chronicle of 511, and also Jordanes himself, actually, they give the impression that actually, after the battle, of course, the Goths immediately retreat before the battle is over. According to Jordanes, that is because Aetius now feared the Goths and thought that if the Goths eliminated the Huns, then he couldn't sort of face the Goths. So he's afraid of the Goths and needs the Huns as a counterweight. So he tricks them into retreating. Now that is bizarre, to say the least. Yes. And then, of course, there is a later source, Gregory of Tours, I think, who says that Aetius also persuaded the Franks, who were his allies, to leave as well. So basically, the entire coalition departs from the battlefield, leaving the Huns in possession of the battlefield.
And disintegrates, virtually.
Disintegrates. And then, of course, the Chronicle of 511 tells us that Lauderic, who was the blood relative of Attila, was killed in the battle. And interestingly, the only archaeological remains that can be, with reasonable, with certainty attributed to the battle, are actually these funerary vestments that were used to bury somebody who was of very high noble, status amongst the Huns. And that those funerary vestments were discovered in the vicinity of the presumed battlefield. So I think everything points, if they could waste their time conducting funeral in the vicinity of a proper funeral in the vicinity of the battlefield, I think that pretty much implies that they were in possession of the battlefield. And now, of course, all of these are circumstantial observations. But I think what really shows who won or who didn't is what happens next. Right? So the very next year, in 452 AD, the Huns invade yet again, and they conduct two campaigns in the same year, one in Gaul and one in Italy, of course. Now, if the Huns had been defeated the previous year, what happens next is completely bizarre, because the Huns penetrate so far west that the next encounter with supposedly the Goths again, and so Jordanes says that the Goths repelled the Huns yet again, but they didn't do much of the fighting. The Alans, apparently the Gothic king used the Alans to beat back the Huns. So it's another bizarre passage of Jordanes. He's obviously trying to give credit to the Goths wherever possible, but here it's a bit wishful thinking. But anyway, what is clear is that there was a battle fought between a Hunnic contingent, and the Alans probably in the Loire region. So that's far, far to the west of the battle site. So if the Huns had been vanquished and they had lost the battle, how on earth is it possible to find a Hunnic army further west than the battlefield the very next year? And the Huns, as if they had suffered nothing, invade Italy the following year and, of course, cause havoc. And it is Aetius, according to Prosper, who is the contemporary source, who is unable to do anything. Right? So if the Romans had won, why can't they defend Italy? In fact, Aetius, according to Prosper, told the emperor that he should abandon Italy altogether because it is impossible to defend Italy. And so Aetius is nowhere to be found either in Gaul, which is his fief, basically his domain, or in Italy. And the Western Roman army has all but disappeared. And thereafter, of course, there is no Western Roman army anymore. All the armies that the later Roman emperors managed to scrap together are actually mercenary forces that are not like the army that Aetius commanded. So yes, Aetius used a lot of foreign mercenaries too, but they were all integrated into the Roman military system.
He had an army.
Yes, he had an army, yes. But later, of course, these are mercenary armies commanded by barbarian commanders who owe no allegiance to the emperor, but who's just been hired to tackle another barbarian army. Right? So the Roman military collapse was total in the West thereafter. And of course, people like Aegidius and Syagrius, etc., people tend to, I think, exaggerate their importance. But even they were clearly dependent on forces that were not classically defined as Roman, right? British exiles from the British Isles, the Franks, Saxons, and so on and so forth. So I think that all of that, I think, makes it pretty clear that what happened is that the Huns probably won the battle, but they were retreating anyway back to their winter quarters. So they left a garrison in place and continued the invasion thereafter, which is why there is that collision in the Loire region in the year after. And of course, according to the Franks, King Childeric, who was the first king of the Franks, was enthroned by a Hun called Wiomad. Right? So again, that implies that the Huns had maintained a certain level of influence, or were significant in the regions that the Hunnic army had passed through during the invasion of 451 and stayed there to a certain extent. And all of that, I don't think, is explainable if we were to, think of the Battle of Chalons or as a decisive Roman victory or a Hunnic defeat.
And we could also make an argument that a retreating Hunnic army wouldn't necessarily mean a Hunnic defeat, because if we can still assume that the Hunnic army is more or less cavalry based, we have, of course, the difficulty of maintaining large amounts of horses in what is now France. And if they had campaigned there for most of a year, I guess most of the fodder and the grass would have been gone. So moving places is something a nomadic or semi-nomadic army has to do just to remain operative. So that would make sense.
Yes, and there is that, and also I think there is the tactical component to a strategic component to consider, and that is Attila was looking to destroy the Western Roman army. That was his objective in invading Gaul because his quarrel was with the emperor, not actually with Aetius. What he wanted to do was invade Italy, but before he invades Italy, he needs to destroy the Roman field army. So that's what he does in the Eastern Roman context as well. During the War of 447, he seeks out and destroys the Roman field army first. Right? So that's what he does. So exactly the same pattern is repeated in the West. He seeks out the Western Roman field army, which is under Aetius in Gaul. But the thing is, the Huns penetrate deep into Gaul, but the Roman army keeps on withdrawing before him. So the Romans do not actually engage the Huns until the Huns have a very sort of botched siege of Orleans. Right? It's actually not the Romans who put up a fierce resistance there. It's actually the Alans, who have actually been given Orleans as their sort of domain by Aetius. So they're defending their territory. They defend it tenaciously. And the Huns feel that we've had enough. So they start returning. And only then do the Romans and the Goths, who have allied with each other, follow and pursue, thinking that this is the time to strike. The Huns are retreating. And now that invites an interesting sort of a question, and that is, was this a feint? The feigned retreat in order to draw out
the defenders
using to engage is a very typical steppe tactic. It's used over and over again. And so the Huns, of course, instead of continuing to retreat, they turn around and engage.
And fight, yes.
And fight. So it's obviously that's what they wanted to do. And so regardless of how we view the outcome of the battle, I think what is clear, and I think this would not be too controversial, is that thereafter, the Western Roman army was a pale reflection of its former self, and it ceased to function in a way that was conducive to maintaining the integrity of the empire. And so,
if the Huns were the only source of that, we of course cannot say, but at least we can guess that if anybody defeated the Huns in France, it was more the Alans than Aetius.
Yes, I think so too. They were the ones who fought the Huns, of course. That's very clear. So they were placed in the center, according to Jordanus, because they were unreliable. But because, of course, the Huns were in the center of the battle line, right? So that's why they were placed there, because they were the only ones who had the capacity to stop them. And of course, the Visigoths fought their kin, the Ostrogoths, and of course, on the other side, the Romans fought the Gepids and other Germanic sort of levies that the Huns had brought with them. And by this stage, of course, Attila is regarded more or less as a Germanic king by the Germanic tribes that he's leading. In fact, the very name Attila, of course, it has a Turkic origin, but the Goths made it into a Gothic name. So, of course, Ataila, right, little father.
Yes.
So the original meaning is something like great ruler. Atil, of course, in Old Turkish means great, right? Great river or something like that. So more befitting of a ruler's name, right, than
I
little
guess so,
father.
yeah.
But yeah, so the Goths turned his name into a Germanic name, and of course the name of his cousin who was killed during the battle, Lauderich.
Sounds very
completely
Germanic.
It's completely Germanic. So the Huns were, at least in the western half of their empire, had become very Germanicized, right? So in many ways, and I think they deliberately did so in order to ease the transition to their rule of these previously independent and very, very militarily potent tribal confederacies. In order to govern them, it was, I think, they certainly intermarried with the Germanic nobility. Attila did so. Edeko, who is another Hun who was mentioned, his wife was Thuringian. Sorry, not Thuringian. Skiri, which is another. I think there's a bit of debate as to whether they were Germanic or not, but certainly Germanicized by the time that the Huns encountered them. So this is a hybrid entity that we're talking about. It's not so. So the armies on both sides were pretty much the same, right? They had some Germans, they had some Huns and Steppes. I mean, even Aetius had his bodyguard of Huns, right? So there were a bunch of disaffected Huns who stayed with Aetius and fought against.
Aetius had been brought up as a hostage by Huns for some of his youth, so
the opposing armies
certainly knew each other.
Exactly. So in other words, the battle pretty much tells us where well, it tells us a lot about the trajectory of early medieval Europe, where it is heading. It is basically a fusion of certainly Germanic, Roman, and Inner-Asian characteristics. And through the fusion of those three combinations, and of course the influence of Christianity, we get, of course, the distinctive, very distinctive Western Europe or Latin Christendom that emerges thereafter. So the Huns, I suppose, I think in my book in 2013, I was trying to make the hate case too hard, right?
Yeah.
So I think I overplayed my hand, and that's my fault. But I think I've tried to remedy that in my subsequent publications. But I mean, the Huns were, I think, important, but I don't think the point that I was trying to make was that they were the only people who mattered. Of course they weren't, right? So the Roman
It's very rarely the case that there's only one.
Yes. Yeah, of course. I mean, Germanic influence was also very, very important. So all of these factors came together to change what had been a Roman-dominated Western Europe into, of course, the early medieval world that we're familiar with today, the so-called barbarian world.
So thank you very much. I think we've gotten a very broad arc all the way from the Xiongnu to the fields of Catalonia, and that it was very pleasant to talk with you and very knowledgeable for our audience.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation. And I hope your audience finds this interesting.